Okay, so this tutorial, I'm going to try to achieve three things. I want to talk to make sure that we have a good understanding of what a FHIR implementation guide is. I'm going to talk about a way to systematically review an implementation guide. And then we're going to look at comparing different FHIR implementation guides. Now, in some fantasy world, we wouldn't need to really know very much in order to review a FHIR implementation guide. And I'd like to live in that world. But the complexity of healthcare is such that FHIR itself has a bunch of complexities, and as we get further along and bite into further and further rich problems, it's becoming, we're building a bigger body of knowledge. And so it's now necessary to talk about what we're doing. So I'm doing this because it's pretty clear to those of us who run our overall FHIR process that the principal rate limiting step for our community is our ability to scale ballot review. We're getting ballot comments. The number of ballot comments is kind of fairly constant, and we're just spreading it over more and more guides, and so they're getting less and less review, and there seems to be less confidence amongst people around this. And so we're now trying to figure out how to stop stuff going to ballot, not because we can't produce the ballot material, but because the community is not keeping up. So this is part of a program to improve our capacity for doing ballot review, and that's because for the community that we have, ballot success is formal evidence that we've reached consensus. We're building up our processes to ensure that ballot success really is formal consensus or formal evidence of consensus, but it does require people to actually ballot. So partly this tutorial is about improving the ballot process, and also because we want to improve the overall maturity process. So I'm talking about implementation guide review with a focus on ballot, but it's really more about parsing and understanding implementation guides. And then there's a kind of a circular feedback process back into implementation guides to bring the overall maturity both to the guides and to the community and their output. So feel free to ask questions at any time. This is where we laugh at Paul because he hasn't been here before and he sat where the microphones are. Lucky Paul. So if someone can volunteer to run around with the microphones when people want to ask questions, that's so the video gets them. So yeah, do feel free to ask questions at any time, and the further we get into the tutorial, the more interactive it's going to get. Okay, so first of all, general principle for implementation guides. So the way that we think about implementation guides is a three-legged journey. There's 3 legs to the journey. And there's 2 fellas here and a 3-legged race. Different kind of 3 legs. HL7 defines the base standard where we establish the capabilities and create common engineering and a common community. But actually, other organisations in HL7 do this. They define the basic capability platform standards. And then some community, that's a smaller community, gets together and says we can make a smaller, because we're smaller, we can get more agreement. We have less disagreement in our circles. So that particularly implies that you're smaller not merely by size, but you've selected a smaller community by some kind of common criteria, a common country, a common mission, and the more selections you can make, the more commonality you get, the more agreements you can get. And then those communities adapt the platform standards and combine multiple platform standards together, and then publish implementation guides that say, this, for this problem that we share, this is how we're going to approach this problem. And some of you will remember Wes Rischel, who used to be a key member of HL7. We've got what we call the Wishel rule, which is that if you change the consensus group, you change the consensus. And so that's an ongoing problem for us, because if you take two communities that are constituted around exactly the same constitution rules, but different individuals, and they'll come to a different consensus. That's both good and bad, right? Because that's just the way the consensus process works. So we're always fighting to try and leverage the Wishel rule and also to fight against its downfalls. And lots of organisations do this community profiling thing. It's IHG's central business, although, you know, I think of XDS as a platform standard. Argonaut, DaVinci, HL7 does it as well. This I grabbed an Australian slide when I grabbed this slide, so some Australian entities do it. ONC, there's a bunch of MITRE, bunch of leaders lead a community. But even once you've got that point and you've published your implementation guide, you've talked about what you've taken from what could be done to what will be done, but it hasn't yet been done. And the third leg of the process is to drive solutions into the market, and that requires money and agreements and deployment and people that actually do change. And we at HL7 are getting more and more interested in the overall cycle rather than purely thinking about the base standard. And that's raised all sorts of challenges for us in terms of how we interact with the other organisations and challenges for them. But we value their communities and their leadership in their communities, so it should settle out. Okay. So a good FHIR implementation guide then represents the community. The community's got together and said, this is what we're going to do. And it has to have buy-in or it doesn't really exist. I've seen this plenty of times. Some top-down agency decides that it can decide what's going to happen, makes the rules and publishes them, and the community that's going to implement them says, we're not going to do that. Or if the politics is such that they can't say they're not going to do it, then they say they're going to do it, but they don't. I've seen this, like I was in China a couple of years ago, and the Chinese decision makers were telling me that nobody in China was using FHIR because they hadn't authorised it, and all of the programmers are coming up to me and saying, we love FHIR, we use it everywhere, but don't tell the bosses. So there has to be a community behind the implementation guide, and the implementation guide, the primary definition of goodness is that it represents its community well. And that's a challenge for us, and I'll come back to this later in the tutorial when I talk about the desire of the wider community for the wider community to all agree with me. And note the subtle change in perspective that happened in that sentence. Now, a good FHIR IG should also have some good quality metrics, should internally be consistent, it should be correct against the specification, it should be efficient, which is, for me, I mean by that is the reader of the specification should quickly and efficiently come to understand what the specification says. They shouldn't be filled with words that don't help them. Now, the challenge there is that there is lots of different kinds of readers, some of who need lots more assistance and background and context, and others that don't and find that painful. And so then there's this sort of feedback process between the community that you're representing and the wider and the consumers of the IG. Now, for some communities, that's pretty much one and the same, and all of the people in the community are all deeply technical FHIR, Illuminati, you want a really dense FHIR implementation guide. Whereas others, you've got a bunch of new players, you've got a lot of new people are going to be coming in and engaging with the implementation guide. You don't want an author who represents a deep tradition inside a community who's not, sympathetic, emotionally sympathetic to newbies. And so there's sort of tension there between that, and that's why it comes back to who's the community. The community of production and the community of consumption of an implementation guide. But that's what we're seeking, is that kind of efficiency. One thing we actually are going to be proposing to do, which is that every implementation guide that we publish will have to come with a consumer summary, a patient summary, that explains to a journalist or a empowered patient or so forth just where this implementation guide fits into the overall health ecosystem. Because that's one piece of feedback we've had. We believe that some of our implementation guides are really significant in terms of, influencing the ecosystem, but it's only us who think that, and people who don't have our perspective just look at it and go, I just don't have a clue what this is. So we're going to be proposing to HL7 that every implementation guide needs a patient/consumer, orientation guide. But that might be necessary for clinicians as well, for instance, for some implementation guides. The implementation guide should clearly describe what you have to do to get it right, what you have to do to be conformant to the implementation guide. Now, you can easily write an implementation guide that correctly describes what you have to do to get it right, but doesn't do so clearly. And that gets back to what we've been talking about. And then a lot of this is about good documentation and the many perspectives problem. Another thing about the implementation guide is it should be consistent with other implementation guides. Consistent to some degree, and that's going to continue to challenge us going forwards. And finally, a good implementation guide is not a one-off document which is an island to the rest of the world. An implementation guide is a milestone in a process. And so it should clearly situate it in the process. If you want to comment on the implementation guide, where do you do that? If you want to become part of the community that owns the implementation guide, where do you do that? If you want to test your implementation, where do you do that? Those are things that an implementation guide should do, on the grounds that an implementation guide always represents a community of practice. And that's not necessarily the same as the official publisher. We know that HL7 is a growing broad organisation. Just because you know it's an HL7 implementation guide doesn't mean you know how to get in contact with the relevant parties. Okay, is there any questions about that or comments? Okay. Now, broadly speaking, we have in the... Yeah.
How quickly could you take statements like that and turn it into template guidance so that when we do our IGs, if you're envisioning this means your IG will now have a section titled blah, blah, blah on the heading with the instruction that says it includes the following kind of information. Can't you just incorporate this kind of best practice guidance into the template so that from this day forward, all IGs will address what you just pointed out?
Well, I think it would be excellent to have a section on the front page of the implementation guide with a set of check boxes whereby you check the boxes and you've achieved a good quality implementation guide. But no, none of these things here have I talked about are technically tick the box things. They're challenges around how you conceptualize and approach the construction of the IG. And if you look at our IGs, you'll see a real variety of approaches to this, because there's a variety of communities and community engagements. So I don't think that it's going to be as easy as that. I'm pretty sure, especially since I'm about to say this, that Lloyd's at the back going, I better put some notes of some of this stuff in the, templates and so forth. But that's the ongoing process. And a lot of this is, not something you simply write into the IG. But of course, and this will keep coming up throughout the tutorial, things that I say here about what we should look for as reviewers will automatically become things that the editors have to worry about more. Okay. Anything else? Alrighty. So we in our set of implementation guides that I have seen, we pretty much have 4 base categories of implementation guide. First is a national implementation guide. It doesn't actually describe an implementation. It describes how the base regulations for the national health infrastructure apply in the context of FHIR, and that turns out to mean mostly is describing the jurisdictional code systems, the jurisdictional identifiers, the extensions that arise naturally from the regulations. So for instance, to illustrate in Australia, in USA, here there's race, ethnicity, they appear everywhere, so we put them in US core, I'll come back to US core in a sec. And then we have, for instance, in Australia, there's a checkbox that goes on the patient record for whether the patient should be exempt for certain billing procedures, and it arises out of the patient demographics, but it's a custom thing to Australia. So in the National Australian Implementation Code, we document an extension for this particular checkbox that all health information systems are required to carry and communicate. So that's the base National Implementation Guide. Then there's domain of knowledge implementation guides that focus on a clinical or a business concept, talk about how to represent that. They're not concerned with an exchange. They're not concerned with a business process. They're concerned with the clinical context. So we've got, in the current round of balloting, we've got a breast cancer implementation guide, which is being balloted, and that's one of those, a domain of knowledge implementation guide. Then we have a community of implementation, which is agreed on a particular exchange of some kind or other that they're going to do as a group, and it's a specific set of agreements that create a foundation for interoperable products to some degree. So US Core is also a community of implementation guide. It's serving a dual purpose, and that's actually a problem. And at some stage, it's going to have to split. And that's created problems already for implementers deriving parallel community of implementation guides that actually want to be deriving off a national implementation guide, not a parallel implementation guide. So it turns out that this categorization matters. And then there's product-specific implementation guides where someone's not describing what other people should do, they're describing what I did do. HL7 doesn't publish product implementation guides, but there are ones that exist and that are published, although I'm not aware of any that are published in public. Yeah, Mark.
Yeah, so I'm just curious, in US, what aspects of community of implementation have crept into the national implementation guide?
Probably the two outstanding things that make it, well, the fact that it has an API in it means that it's not a national implementation guide. The API is a community of implementation. But the two particular features that stand out in US Core as not suitable for a national implementation guide are some of the must supports and the minimum cardinalities on name, for instance. Right? Those are the kind of things that don't belong in a national implementation guide. Yeah. Okay, and that's a running thorn for us. And I believe we at least agree now that we need to address that. I don't know what the plan for addressing it is, but we at least agree. So when you think about an implementation guide, you need to think in these terms. What is it that I'm actually looking at? Does that fit what I think it should be? All right. Yeah, down the back there.
So I think I heard the other day that the focus on implementation guides was all around the interoperability and being able for software engineers to write the code. But I got excited when you were talking about this domain of knowledge IG, because I feel like that's where a lot of the things I would produce fall. It's more in getting the semantics right and in getting the concepts fully defined, helping people understand different domains.
Yeah, so yeah, we have these, and these are important, and we'll have more of these as we go on, and we want more of these. What we say is that the implementation guides are for implementers. Now, a certain set of people hear us say programmers or developers when we say implementers, but that is not what we said. Anybody who implements. Now, these kind of guides, the implementation will be split across programmers, system administrators, Epic and Cerner configurators, whatever we want to call them, right? Business analysts for clinical communities. Implementers is more than just developers, but we're focused on people who have to make stuff work, for whatever reason they have to make stuff work. But we do definitely need to see, and now I said you should know what it is. Now, it's possible that you might have an implementation guide that contains more than one of these things, and I said US core is a problem because we didn't split out what the national base is, but it's not wrong for an implementation guide to be more than one of these things. You just have to be really clear about what you're doing and what you're reviewing so you understand what it is going on. Yep. And for instance, you could imagine that this is work in progress now, a registry, a disease-specific registry, are concerned with publishing a good domain of knowledge for the particular disease they're concerned with, whether it's some particular kind of cancers, and there's a bunch of work around cancer in this space, but they're also concerned with how they get hold of the data and how you get it to them, so they would be doing a combination. They might be better off for everybody if they did a separate thing, but that's not necessary. It might be better. Okay? All right. So typically, a general FHIR implementation guide, although specifically depends on what that's doing, is going to have 4 kinds of things in the implementation guide. It's going to have some kind of exchange specification that talks about when content gets exchanged, how it gets exchanged, what are the security arrangements around the exchange, and if there's an API, what does the API look like? FHIR defines a very big API. Which bits are we going to use? Then it's going to contain some content specifications, which typically are profiles, also known as templates and archetypes and so forth, and there are rules for the content that gets exchanged. And that will include terminology specifications, which is rules for what codes can or must be used. And then it will also contain relationship material, which relates those things to other sources of knowledge or content, other standards. And so, in fact, I should probably go back. I mean, really, this slide here, I should probably add that we're going to start having mapping IGs. The focus of the IG is to map to a different standard representation. And also to map the exchanges that are possible to the wider business context. So those are roughly the parts that you're going to expect to see. You don't need to see an exchange specification, but pretty much if you see content specification, you should be seeing terminology as well. That'll be a regular theme. Any questions about it? Comments? All right. In addition, implementation guide is going to have an identity that establishes its name and how you reference it, and those are going to be consistent going forwards. And in particular, So it's going to have a name, it's going to have a milestone which tells you where it is in the overall cycle, and that milestone will be tied. It'll have a FHIR version as well. And this is a matter of considerable confusion that we don't know how to fix. For instance, we're currently working on US Core R3 based on FHIR R4. And it gets worse because we're currently working on, I forget the name of it, but random IG R2 based on US Core R3 based on FHIR R4. Or we could be at version 5 of something because it's iterating faster. There's clearly plenty of minefields for people to fall into there. We haven't figured out what to do about that. I don't know that we can. We've been talking about it for 3 years and we've got precisely 0 ideas. And then each FHIR implementation guide, as well as a name, it has a package ID. So I've got the package ID for US Core there, hl7.fire.us.core. For implementation guides published by HL7, the FHIR product manager with FMG, that's me, manages that code. And for implementations guide published through FHIR Foundation, well, I manage them as well. So whatever is there is my decision. And then also every package, every FHIR implementation guide, when published, has a version. And the version, there's a set of rules that apply to the version that I choose, but we only ever publish, and so the version identifies a particular instance of the guide uniquely. And so then the guide has 2 URLs associated with it, which will keep coming up through today. A canonical URL, which is where the guide itself is published at, and then the version-specific URL, where this particular, a particular version of the implementation guide is published. So those 2 ideas will keep cropping up. And so for all HL7 and FHIR Foundation implementation guides, there's an algorithmic transform between the package ID and the canonical URL, but it doesn't have to be algorithmic. But every organization that publishes FHIR implementation guides should be assigning package IDs and has to have a canonical URL. And then the actual content of an implementation guide has 2 parts. There's a narrative, which is a set of HTML files and images built from handwritten content and generated structured presentation of computable content. And then there's a computable representation, which is an NPM package published at the version URL /package.tgz, which includes everything a tool needs to know about the implementation guide. So all the computable parts of the implementation guide. And so all the tools that we have are migrating to use the package ID and to use a package distribution mechanism when they want access to the content of the implementation guide and the validator. That's how the validator works. So that's what I want to remember, is that an implementation guide has 2 parts. There's the narrative and then there's the package as well. Any questions or comments about that? Yeah.
There might not be an answer for this, but I'll ask anyways. Do you know if there's a process where vendors, IG authoring tool vendors, are in sync with these requirements as they are developed and more refined?
It's work in progress. So there's not a formal process for tooling vendors. Every tooling vendor that is producing implementation guides through the IG publisher is forced to conform to these requirements. They don't have any choice. Simplifier doesn't yet conform to all these requirements. That's work in progress, and why at the present you can't author implementation guides to be published by HL7 through Simplifier. I do not know of any other vendors of implementation guide frameworks. IHE is migrating to use the IG publisher. But if you know of them, and I don't, let me know about them and we'll chat to them, because we'd like them to be part of our community process, informal process.
Well, the one that Karen project is using is the Trifolia on FHIR.
Yeah, so Trifolia uses RG Publisher and is fully conformant. Yeah.
Thanks.
Paul?
Yeah, why in the version-specific photo are you using the date instead of version?
Honestly, that's a good question. Our version policy really only hardened up relatively late in the process, and HL7 had a long tradition of using the date or the name of the distribution. So it's actually dates too simple. So it would be STU1 or STU2 or 2019 May. And we started using that before we had got all of this in place. We have kept using the same framework from the one we've been using from the beginning, with named or dated releases rather than versioned releases. But the core specification, there are redirects, very deep redirects for all of the versions. So if you access it by like /FHIR/R4, you just get redirected to the right place. I haven't put that in place for the implementation guides that we publish on hl7.org, but I could just generate everything. So we could change our policy. That would be an FMG decision.
Perhaps be useful then just to replace on the slide the date with a date tag, so we're not thinking it's the actual date of release.
Yeah, probably. It's not the actual date of release. That's something that catches people a bit unaware. A 2019 May indicates that it was actually released in March. That's clear to everybody? It's obvious? Yeah. That's how we've worked for a long time, because it's the May ballot. Because we reconciled it, we finished it, closed it and reconciled it in May. We actually opened it probably in March, but maybe
Worse
early
yet,
April.
It actually applies to the year and month that the working group meeting occurs at which the comments are reconciled.
Yeah.
So the next ballot cycle is actually 2020 February.
Great, that's good.
I'm also concerned about the /date, because in the packaging we use the version number, and this could lead to a lot of confusion for implementers. Sorry.
It has not, as yet, caused anybody to ask me about it until today. So I feel as though it's a manageable confusion, but what I'll do is I'll generate every redirect that could possibly be, and then I'll bill Paul for the time. I can generate the redirects. I have the knowledge to generate every redirect you could possibly imagine. It's only every so often I have to like download or upload to the HL7 website, and it's painful because all the redirects are actually little ASP scripts on a single directory with a single file in it, and the full FHIR directory has about 500,000 redirect files on it. The FTP don't do well with that. All right, anything else? Okay. So I'm just going to give you a lightning tour of the key conformance resources. It's a code system that defines concepts along with their codes, displays, definitions, and properties. The system defined in the code system plus the code plus the version refers to that concept throughout the FHIR ecosystem, and displays and properties are used throughout the system. We have value sets, which selects a set of concepts and their codes from one or more code systems. You can list them or you can choose them by their properties, and that's called a concept logical definition. And then we can also generate expansions. So what it is just a set of rules for what's in the code system, and then there's the expansion for what's in it today, for what's in that so it meets that set of rules. In all of the implementation guides, we publish the formal definition of the value set along with an expansion by the tools for today. Okay, the expansion is for illustrative purposes only. We don't distribute that expansion as a computable construct. It's only visible to humans when they look at the implementation guide, if the author chooses to make it visible. Okay, before I take questions, it's a big change in FHIR for HL7 historically. We've elevated terminology to be front and centre. You can and you must author fully, control the concepts fully. It wasn't our idea. CTA was doing it. We just finished the process, as it were. But if you go longer back into HL7, we just published version 2 messages. Who knew anything about terminology? And there's still parts of the ecosystem catching up to the fact that we did that. All right, does anyone want to ask any questions about that? Yes, you do, Mark, I can see.
Yeah, of course, if I ask every question, I'm really bad.
We never get out of here. So I'm just wondering, because this is not, we have somewhat of a unique packaging problem, I guess, with version, but, it's software. And software packaging is not something that's new. Part of the philosophy of FHIR is to use common web tools. I think we've kind of sort of done that a little bit.
Tried, yeah.
So, why not do a package.json, which we do, right? But does it cover all the package versions in a uniform way such that it can be downloaded from the web and use tools that are out there, because we're not the first one in the world to have a configuration problem?
There's a big, long part of the answer to that, but we do distribute standard NPM packages, although that's entirely a lie, since for most people a standard NPM package is actually a bunch of JavaScript code, although that's not part of the NPM spec. So, and we don't presently upload our NPM packages to the public NPM server, and we're still iffing and umming and ahhing about whether we should do that, since they're not JavaScript packages. And we're currently using a different distribution mechanism and planning on having our own NPM package server using the NPM protocol, so not npm registry.js. Other than that, version management is this big, long, complicated subject that everybody wants to join in and argue about, so feel free to join in next time we start arguing about that. But we do distribute the code system to the value sets in the NPM package. Okay, any other questions? All right. We have structure definition, which defines a tree structure of element definitions. This is language I'm going to use later. We use them internally to define base types and resources, and also to define a pattern of rules imposed over the top of another set of definitions, which is what we call a profile. So implementation guides don't define new types or resources, just profiles on existing types, although they can define what we call logical models, which is their own class models. And quite a few implementation guides do that. And then for each element in the tree, there's an element definition which has got a path and ID that identify it, definitions, comments, mappings, type restrictions, invariants, and bindings to terminology. And some of those ideas will keep recurring later. Any questions? Yeah.
How come when you look at the definitions of resources, it looks like an IG?
Because we use the same code to present the structure definition.
So then what's the difference then? If it's the same code and it's an IG, why isn't it an IG?
So the platform standard, the FHIR, defines all of the engineering constructs, the base resources. And all of the exchanges that happen use those base resources, but they just apply sets of rules on top of those resources. But they're all interoperable because they're all using the same resource. The fact that they look the same is because we use the same code to render them so they look the same, but they actually work differently at the typing level. Then we get to the API level. We've got an operation definition, which defines the parameter signatures for an operation and where it is and what it does. Implementation guides can define new operations and constrain existing ones. And then there's a capability statement, which is a definition of an API. It's security rules, which resource and interactions it supports, what search parameters it supports, and documentation on those things. Questions or comments about that? All right, and then there's concept map and structure map, which define relationships between code systems, and also you can use them to map conceptually between like resources and models, because they're kind of implied systems of concepts with codes. And there's structure maps that define formal transforms between source and target content. So you can actually execute those, and the implementation guide generator will actually execute those. Lisa.
Graham, back one slide. The capability statement is an executable thing, right? Or is it just human readable? I'm just wondering what's the expectation around having any kind of executed capability around a capability statement?
So the capability statement is computable, so that it's a formal declaration of the APIs and the types and the signatures and the behaviors of what the API does. You can generate Swagger documents, which are open API documents, from a capability statement, although there's some devil in the details there. You can generate API code. You can point a tool at the capability statement and generate test cases, crude test cases, but
so
test
that's
cases.
what I'm getting at. So like, would an Aegis system be able to do something with the security rules that are in the capability statement to do any kind of testing on it, or is that really just to communicate the expectations?
It's certainly theoretically possible. I'm just trying to remember what Richard told me about that. I think you can upload a capability statement to it, and it will test the presence or absence of the things that you said in the capability statement that it knows about. But if you, for instance, defined a custom operation and referred to the custom operation, then you'd probably need to write code in the test tool for supporting that. So it's a bit of a mixed picture in terms of automatically doing stuff like that. All right. Did anyone ask you about the mapping stuff? Yeah. We got a microphone here.
Do we have examples for the concept map and structure map that kind of illustrate how IG authors can create their specific IGs? But this is an advanced topic, and as part of the CAD and Blue Button implementation guide creation, the structure map I can definitely see being used to represent the mapping.
Yeah, we do have quite some examples, and ask on the IG creation channel, and we'll point you to some of those examples.
Okay. Is the structure map basically created using the FHIR mapping language?
That is what it is, yes.
Okay, right.
Okay. And then we get to the edge case resources. Graph definition, which most people haven't got their heads around, but will eventually be important, which I'm not going to talk about more today. And test scripts. An implementation guide can contain test scripts, which are actual test cases for a server or even a client to pass. Now, it's much harder to write test cases and include them in the implementation guide. And the reason is because almost all implementation guides pass through quite a bit of what they do to some underlying knowledge resources. Like they'll say, use the current release of SNOMED here. Typically, unbound versions of terminologies is a great example. But when you actually create test cases, you have to go bind to a particular version of a terminology so you can actually test the correct inputs and outputs. And so if you put your test cases in the implementation guide, you've got a version problem. right? Because the implementation guide can be unversioned on some things, but your test cases probably can't be. I had a few people ask me about this in the last few months. Can I put test cases in your implementation guide? And you can, but it doesn't mean you should. And if you are reviewing an implementation guide, well, you should ask yourself what test cases are there and where are they? They probably should not be in the implementation guide. If they are, why are they? Is that okay? Will they go defunct much more quickly than the IG? If they are not, is there a reference to some kind of testing community or framework? That would be a rational question to ask, and I forgot to write it into my notes further into this today, so it's probably the last time we'll mention that subject. Any questions about that? Yeah, Jose.
Why not test cases to say this is what you must do, we'll throw this data at you, and if you don't succeed, don't even bother saying you're compliant?
So why not put full test cases in the implementation guide?
Not some test cases, like sunny day scenario test cases there.
If the community agrees to that, if you can write the implementation guide, the test cases, and get them right, if you can write them in such a way that they're not going to degrade because of version issues, sure, it's a good idea, right? It means that the implementation guide becomes really, really meaningful. Just those things are all big ifs, that's all. I mean, my standard rule is you should write down everything that people will agree to. And if they'll agree all the way through the test cases, you should write them down. All right. So the process of building an implementation guide, you write as much as you possibly can using those conformance resources. And what that means is that those are available to the tools through the package distribution framework for code generation, form generation, validation, republishing of the content in other contexts, reuse generally. And not everybody has been publishing FHIR implementation guides based on the conformance resources, but everybody that I know of that's been chose some other way because it was easier, has the community going, can you just do it right? Can you just go to publishing conformance resources because we want all of those benefits? And then you create narrative and images as required for the rest of the implementation guide, all the documentation stuff I talked about. Then you take all those fragments and a bunch of fragments generated by the IG publisher, and you use an HTML template to assemble a final web document, which is the set of documents that you, the human reviewer, sees. So it's a mix of human-written documentation and documentation generated from the conformance resources, and you publish that through the CI build site, which is build.phir.org/IG. Then you iterate that for thousands of hours, eventually leading to a milestone that the community agrees to, which you then publish through the HL7 or FHIR Foundation, and that means Lynn or I do that, and we register that in the publicly available registries. And then you go back to the start, and you just keep iterating that cycle, and keep, that's a service to the community as the community manages their process. So when you review an implementation guide, it looks like a bunch of HTML to you if it's well put together, and we're getting better at this. It's all seamless, but when you actually comment on a particular piece of text, it can be very difficult for the author to figure out where it came from. They often need to chat with me to find out where it is that it came from. But that's what you review is the HTML output. Any question? Yeah, Paul.
Yeah, can you comment on where in that process you would expect people to ballot?
So we publish, well, I will in a sec, but we publish a milestone, which could be a ballot document, or it could be a trial use document. And then people will ballot on the published document, although you can review and comment on the CI build site as well. But whenever we ballot on a milestone published document that's going to endure. Is that what you wanted?
Yeah, I mean, often we separate between the terms of sorry, we tend to reuse the term publish, right? Because we publish material such that it can then be reviewed, and then at the end of the review, we publish it.
Then we publish it with a capital P.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
you're right,
And
yes.
that sort of overloads it.
Yeah, that's correct. Yes. Publish. For Lynn and I, publish means to go through the process of putting it up. So Lynn and I, we have a document which is on the FHIR wiki if you want to look at it, that we follow, and it differentiates between publishing and publishing a milestone. And a milestone is like a trial use, finishes the cycle, publish a milestone, start again. Anything else? Okay. So we have some typical examples of implementation guides here. So there's US Core. So US Core is the common EHR access. It's got an introduction with history and so forth. Defines who the actors are. The core profiles that it makes available, and I missed them. Capability statements as well, and then terminology. All those parts. Then there would be, like, for instance, we'll look at DaVinci PAS. It doesn't want to go there. The template needs a little bit of work there, Lloyd. Especially when it gets small. I mean, the screen gets small. Phew. It's kind of like contest for space up there. All right. This is a fairly new implementation guide. Hasn't had many cycles, but again, orientation material. All right. Yes.
What DaVinci did a really nice thing from a layperson reading an implementation guide. Anyway, where they have a next page at the bottom of the guide, at the page.
Mm-hmm.
So you can sort of follow it in a sequence that seems to make sense. That's coming to the template. That's very helpful.
So, from my point of view, that's from my point of view, that's tricky because that's next for a particular different individuals have a different sequence to follow, but it is helpful to have like a formal pathway. And we talked a bit yesterday about this in table of contents and how do you know you've seen the whole guide and so forth. And certainly part of our standard is that there will be a table of contents. You may not have seen this, and this is part of your review process, is there is an implementation guide registry on FHIR.org, which lists all the implementation guides that HL7 has published. It doesn't list all of the implementation guides. If you know of any implementation guides or you see any implementation guides that are not on here, please go and hassle the users to put them on here. Anything published to HL7 is on here. IAG has currently got everything on here. Lots of affiliates can't be bothered. It's a pain for me. Yeah.
If we have to review the existing implementation guides, would it be possible to have something like this, but more detailed, and say these guys, they are profiling medication resources, these guys are profiling observations? The answer it is possible, right?
The amount of data becomes overwhelming, and it's work in progress. I mean, we have a FHIR registry which is supposed to do that, and it's at current. It's my major disappointment and a major focus of what I have to do in the rest of this year is to get that sorted. So I'm working on it. The other thing that you might consider is this page here. This page here is built by the CI Build website. It's a record of every implementation guide that's been through the CI Build website. So this includes a bunch of implementation guides. They've never been formally published, so they're not in the registry of published implementation guides. They've just been run through the CI Build site. But this is mainly a process focus on did they succeed? Can we go and look at the logs, what happened? It's a maintenance site for those of us who work on the CI Build infrastructure. But it does, if you want to find what's currently in progress, this is the place to look. It's just not that friendly a place. All right, any questions about that?
Graham, how soon do we register? Like, as we're very first starting, like you talked about the CI site, how soon would we create an entry in the registry?
So you can oops, this is the one I want. You register here if you use the CI Build. In terms of registering in the implementation guide registry, as soon as you have a CI build to point to, as soon as you have something to point to, a continuous integration build, you can register on this website. And if you want to register on this website, I'm not going to go into this in this tutorial, go ask on IG Creation channel and we'll tell you how to do that. Any other questions? All right. So any implementation guide that we publish has to go through and pass a set of publication requirements. These are all technical. So we expect that an implementation guide will have the correct branding. It will clearly display on the implementation guide, for instance, here. No. Let's go for this one. It will have the name and the version up the top here. Down the bottom here, it will have the correct copyright statement. It will include the package ID. It'll have a date. It'll have a link to a version history. It'll have this yellow box at the top here, which orientates you in terms of the overall publishing sequence. Those are things that all implementation guides that we publish must have. And Lynn and I enforce that in the publication process. And another is that the implementation guide is not allowed to refer to the CI build site because that would be hopelessly confusing since that's unstable, except unless it's explicitly referring to the build CI build to say, look at the CI build for future. So we enforce all those things when we publish through HL7. If an implementation guide that you're looking at and reviewing has not been published through HL7, and so that means for ballot or whatever, none of those rules may have been followed. So you need to orientate yourself against those things because you can't take them for granted outside the HL7 or the FHIR Foundation process. The editors know and dearly love these rules because they're easy to meet. Any questions about that? Okay, now the one thing that I'll tell you is that some of the less publishing orientated quality requirements can be waived by FMG. So when a committee is coming and they're running out of time and the ballot deadlines are approaching and they are the worst things in our lives, the ballot deadlines, we can say, well, you clearly haven't met the quality criteria, we won't be balloting you this cycle. And they're like, but actually we kind of really want to go to ballot because our community's, expecting that. And so if the communities can convince FMG and TSC, which is the Technical Steering Committee, that publishing anyway helps the community best, we will waive requirements if we think that that's not going to waste the balloters' time. But if we do, typically we will require a note to balloters. So here's a note to balloters. We will require something here. So when you're reviewing an implementation guide, you read that and see what it says and whether that affects how you review the document. Any questions about that or comments? Okay. Now, if you are reviewing HL7's implementation guides at this time, you will be perfectly aware that we're all over the place in terms of how we lay out implementation guides and how they look and feel. We have been converging, but we haven't yet converged. As of probably the next cycle, the 2020 February cycle, all implementation guides that we publish will probably be required to use the standard HL7 template, so they will have a much more consistent structure. Authors won't have to worry about hacking with the HTML. IG is going to have their own template, and other organisations can have their own templates, so we get to a more standard look and feel. It's kind of a pendulum thing. When we first started working on implementation guides, I chose the look and feel. Everybody jumped up and down and said, you can't choose that, we need to be able to choose our own. So then we went to a tool that let you choose your own, and everyone said, hey, we need some consistency. So there you go. All right, so that's coming, but it hasn't yet affected anything that we publish today. Now, I just want to tell you how publication works. I told you before that when an implementation guide is defined, not a particular publication, but when the implementation guide itself is first defined, it gets given the information we need to register it, to publish it, to create its history, and it's given a canonical URL and a package ID. So HTTP or HL7.FHIR.realm, and the primary realms that you'll see is US, UK, CH for Switzerland, AU for Australia, and UV, which is universal, global, UV. So UV is international. That's another weird code that we chose and have stuck with. And then a code is agreed to when we first define the IG, and we try to choose a code that's a reasonable human reference, so core or DaVinci-PASS or whatever. So then each milestone that we publish is assigned a version, and it's major release, minor release, technical correction, and then it's published, it's given a version name, and which is STU1 or 2019 May, as we discussed. It's published at that, and each IG also has a published history. The computer processable version of the history is at canonical/package-list.json, or there's a human readable one which you get to by history.html, which generally redirects you to some active script that loads the history from the JSON file on the server and then renders it in the browser. So whenever you see like an IG history, so I'll show you this for US Core. So you go to US Core and you see the directory of published versions, and you go to this page, which contains a description of what the US Core implementation guide does and the published history of US Core. And that published history is actually built on the fly from this file, package-list.json, which has got all of that information in it, along with the most important thing in terms of reviewing an IG is the change notes. So for instance, when we published release 301 of the US Core IG, it came with these change notes. So this is what's changed in the implementation guide. All right, any questions about that? Yeah. Sorry? Those notes are written in package-list.json. So when the author, the editor, submits the content, I mean the actual submission process is they commit their draft for the next version of version entry in package-list.json in their IG folder, in their GitHub repo. Then they send Lynn an email saying this GitHub repo is ready to publish, and we manually copy that entry into the package list and finish filling it out for what Lynn and I know. For instance, the data publication. We know that, and so we fill that out, and then we upload that to the master. So we edit the master.
we as editors, we don't accumulate that, we just provide this is what's new on this one.
Typically what the editors do is they grab the copy from the website, the current copy it into their Git repo, edit it manually. So what we're actually doing is we get a diff from the current one, but we ignore the rest of it anyway, so it doesn't really matter. We only use that entry. Okay. All right. So if you wanted to test the conformance, you can take the package and you can load the package on a terminology server and then do value set expansions and validate code on the terminology server. If you do not have your own terminology server, and it's not that simple to have one, it's close to simple if you're on Windows and you're mates with Jose, who's got a instant run terminology server. If you don't have that, then you can use tx.fire.org, but you have to ask Rob Howsam to load the package on tx.fire.org. We will load on tx.fire.org, we will load packages published for HL7 balloted implementation guides, but we don't have a process for just automatically doing that right now. If you want to test the profiles, you can use the validator. So I will demonstrate that in a second. If you want to test with the capability statement, you can use a test script, or you can use Touchstone. That's out of scope for what I'm doing today. All right. Before I do the demo of the validator, any questions? All right. Nothing. Oh, yes, we do, Oliver.
If I have a value set in the implementation guide, this will not be validated with the validator in terms of terminology. So if I have an own code system and an own value set, I would need to upload it to a terminology server separate first.
Well, if you're asking from the IG publisher includes a mini terminology server inside the IG publisher that's fully capable of doing code system-based value set operations for all the code systems in the terminology, in the IG itself. Expansions, validate code, whatever. And it just falls back to using tx.fire.org for SNOMED and RxNorm and ICD. I just can't load them in the IG publisher process. I don't have time. Nobody wants to wait half an hour to fully load all those things. But it's pretty much unrestricted in terms of what it can do. I know some corner cases that people could break it with, but nobody has yet. So anyway, I'm in and the validator itself also runs the same mini terminology server as well. So you don't need to get the packages, to validate, you do not need to get the packages loaded on tx.fire.org. You only need to do that if you want to just use the terminology services directly.
Thank you.
And if one of our objects of profiling is the value set,
is it what, sorry?
Is a value set, then
yeah.
What we have to do is to say this new version of this implementation guide has added these ones or has deprecated these terms. So we have to do that. We might do that manually. You don't have to.
Well, you need to. The value set should be part of the implementation guide.
But that doesn't go into the history unless we put it there, right?
No, you would have to do that. We just treat everything that you said as current. All right. So let's see how we go with this process. So I said that you should all have the validator running. This is at this point not yet very impressive, but you will see that this will grow in importance as we go forwards. Okay, so let's first of all make this nice and big. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so you feel free to do this, and you might as well, because we'll get to be doing more stuff with the jar later. Okay, so we're going to validate the condition example in US core. Okay. Crumbs. That was pretty silly of me. When I prepped this, I grabbed the wrong version. Sorry, I'll just grab it from the right place. I have it here somewhere. Okay, so that's 4014. It's grabbed the resource I specified from the US Core website, and it's validated it, and it gives me a warning that it could not resolve the profile for US Core condition. So I want to validate against the IG FHIR.us.core. And now it will add US core to its set of stuff it knows about. It loads them all. And now it will say no errors. Okay, unless you're comfortable with the validator, because we'll be using the validator for more stuff later, stuff you haven't seen before, feel free to tell me that you all got that right, working, all good. All right. Now, the ins and outs of using the validator are on this wiki site and all of its many and amazing parameters that I've added for various people. Any questions about that? Yeah.
So you actually just validated the profile itself, not an example of how to use the profile?
So this here, I asked the validator to validate this example condition against, and to have the US core IG in memory when it did that, in scope. So I validated the condition example. I did not validate in this the condition profile itself, because that's already been validated. You'll see that later.
Instead of an example, if you point to the base profile.
Yeah, see up here, success, it was valid, but I warned you that I couldn't find the profile. But it was still valid against the base. Okay. Yeah.
Graham, so what I understand happened is we did not validate it against the IG, we validated it against the package that we have that was produced by the IG, correct?
Well, it's the same thing. Here, we said we want to validate with US core. Okay. Here, so the example in hand, let's pursue this. So the example at hand is this one, condition/example. And if we look at the JSON, you'll see that it nominates the US core in the profile. So when we validated the first time, we just said, hey, validate this against the base spec. And we ran into this and said, hey, I don't know that. I don't know anything about that. So that just warned us that it didn't know that and couldn't validate that. So then we ran it again and we told it to load US core, and it said, oh, I know that, and I validate against that, and it's fine. And then if the example did not have that, then I could actually say explicitly, I want you to validate against that profile by its canonical URL. This, of course, is doing nothing since it already tells you to do this, but that is how you would tell a validator what profile you wanted it to use rather than letting the instance tell you that it wanted to use that profile. Yeah?
The profile you're validating against, can that be a local profile that you're testing, or does that have to be fully published?
Yeah, see, when I've got IG here, you can just nominate a local directory. It'll just load everything out of the local directory or a local file.
Cool.
And that's all stuff that's documented on this page.
There's a little distinction there that when you click on the page using a validator, when I first saw it, it said, like, if you want to validate it against an IG, you get the IG flag. But what you're really doing with the IG flag is loading it into memory, because if that resource doesn't declare that profile, then it wouldn't validate against it, right?
Yeah, you have to actually say you want to validate against that profile.
Right, and then if you're validating against multiple, I guess you just have multiple instances of that IG parameter, like US Core and CCA on FHIR, something like that.
Yeah, we'll come to that in a sec.
Okay.
You're ahead of me. All right, any other questions about the validator?
Is that a publicly available repo that we can look at, how the validation is done?
Yeah, well, so the wiki page is publicly available and you can make changes if you've got a wiki account, which you just have to ask for. The source for the validator is all in FHIR core.
Okay.
All of it's there. And I take PRs against that. But also, some of the validators are the hardest code I've ever written. Okay, all right. Okay, so reviewing an implementation guide. That's so far just the basics. Okay, so why would you review an IG? So first of all, HL7 is balloting the IG and you're part of the ballot pool. And you've decided that you don't want to drag down the ballot pool by declaring that you're part of the ballot pool and then not bothering to be part of the ballot. I encourage you not to make that decision. If you're going to be in the ballot pool, please ballot. Yeah, you're just engaging with the community and you're going to implement the implementation guide, or you are comparing the implementation guide to another implementation guide that you already know, or you are performing a new role that we have at HL7, pre-ballot publication consistency check. So I want to talk about that for a sec. HL7 is getting more and more feedback about this. So we're instituting a formal process during our pre-ballot publication process where we ask some FHIR insiders who know the community and know the processes to specifically review the implementation guide to ask, is this consistent with other implementation guides? Most of the rest of my presentation is heading towards what does that question mean? And what might be the answer. But any of you in the room could consider being candidates for that paid role. It's not a great pay, but it's actually a paid role that we have carved out. And we're trying to grow a community that can actually make that meaningful. So it's not like we've mastered this process, but that's what I am going to be addressing. But first of all, before you can compare IGs, you need to review an IG and be comfortable doing that. So these are the kind of issues that you can find in an implementation. Oh, before I move on, any questions about what I just said? Yeah, it's probably time. Dragon's going to hand out a little handout that will help as I go through, although I'm still a few slides away from it. But we're getting there. Okay. No questions? All right. So these are some of the kinds of issues you can get in an implementation guide. You can find typos. I got to tell you, I review a lot of typos, submissions against FHIR. Around about 20% of the people things people submit as typos are not. If you think the definition's wrong, don't submit a change to the definition as a typo. And then the other thing is about 20% of the typos that are typos are very mystifyingly hard to fix because they're in the generated content. The next thing you could find, sorry, yes?
Question, when I see this, we are assuming English language IGs?
I haven't assumed that.
Okay.
I mean, technically we are assuming American spelling because Americans can't spell. And it's kind of funny actually, in the FHIR course specification, we've got a pre-final release process where a bunch of people go through and review it for grammar and typos. And you can actually go through the historical versions of FHIR and see grammar being fixed and then fixed and then fixed and then fixed because people don't agree about the grammar. And actually the hardest part of that process is that we're past ballot, we've agreed on the content, and people are trying to slip meaningful changes in through grammar corrections. They're just trying to improve the definition with, you know, probably mostly good motivation. But yeah, so typos are tricky. And editors need to review the typos carefully to make sure they're really, really typos, because we do like basically fix typos with no further review. If it's actually a spelling mistake, we're not going to waste committee time asking the committee to like sign off on fixing the spelling of a misspelt word. Okay, the next thing you might find are navigational fails, where you've got broken links, missing and obtuse indexing, and inappropriate menus. We work really hard not to have any broken links, but broken links, typically you'll find them in external links because I can't auto-validate them in the same way. The implementation guide tooling is extremely thorough with internal links. But be sympathetic to implementation guide editors. A typical implementation guide has between 500,000 and 1.5 million hyperlinks in it. There might be things in there that you don't understand, and it may be that you do not have enough domain knowledge, and that's one kind of problem, or it may be that the explanation is obtuse and impossible to understand. I have seen those things. There may be integrity problems where there's different or incompatible statements, either incompatible with the base or internally incompatible. And we work really, really hard to produce logically coherent implementation guides or standards that do not have disagreements, because how could we possibly create disagreements with ourselves? And yet we are constantly having our attention drawn to things that we forgot to change when we agreed to change everything else. And so it's not unusual to find incompatible statements internally. Or there may be requirements problems where requirements are either missing or you're in disagreement with the stated requirements or the unstated requirements, because stating requirements is hard. Or you may disagree with the choices around the solution, and specifically examples might be missing or invalid or inappropriate. Or there may be things the implementation guide doesn't do or doesn't yet do. So those are kind of things that you're looking at. Any comments about that? Questions? No. I'm going to talk a little bit about the ballot process and I'll get to the handout. So the ballot process is that we issue an announcement. Lynn at the back there prepares the announcement in accordance with our rules. Our rules are mystifying and the subject of much internal argument, so the announcements that we produce are really, really hard to bear to look at because they're so loaded with stuff so that nothing's missed out. Then you sign up, and you have to remember to sign up before the ballot opens, and lots of members forget to do that. And then they're, oh, I was going to ballot, but I forgot to sign up. So remember to sign up. Then we have our internal pre-publication review, and then we publish, and then the ballot opens. Then you submit comments, and you can submit comments through a spreadsheet or through GForge, and we're eventually going to change to Jira. And then having made all your line item comments, then you submit your overall ballot response. So, here we go. It's not, I don't have time to do a full ballot tutorial, but I find bits of this process extremely difficult. So that's good, isn't it? Resources. Oh, here we go, that's what I want. I'm not used to seeing it. Such good, oh, here we go. So here's all the announcement documents, a sequence of announcement documents. Then there's the actual name, and these are all formal names. What you will find is that we are not very good at having our formal names align with our used names. We're working on that policy. A link to the published implementation guide, and then a link to a comment document, which is a zip file containing a bunch of Excel spreadsheets with yet another name, which you can then, so let's say we were going to do breast cancer data reporting. So here's a good example. Breast cancer data radiology reporting. The implementation guide is breast radiology reporting, and the ballot comments sheet is breast radiology. Okay, we are just not good at getting those names coherent and comprehensible. And so then you would go through reviewing the implementation guide, making a series of comments. I will talk a little bit more about making these comments. When you've finished and you've made all of the comments that you're going to make, and you've ignored this mystifying CIC bit here, which is wrong, then you make your overall ballot comment. And the assumption is that if you've looked at the ballot and you've said, yeah, and I'll talk about negatives and affirmatives, but one or more of your comments is a negative comment, then your overall vote will be a negative. And so then you go back to the ballot site here and you vote, and I'm not going to go through that now, and you upload your spreadsheet with comments, and then you vote negative, and it goes through to the committee. And then the committee takes all of those and moves them all into Jira, because we need a GForge, a team-based environment with which to resolve the comments. And if you've made comments, you will likely hear from the committee saying, here's your comment in GForge, we got questions for you about it, or we're scheduling time for it. And so you can expect ongoing discussion about your comments. And then the committee will work through all the comments, and eventually you'll get a comeback saying we've reconciled all the comments, we've done something about them. I won't talk about that process for time reasons, and now we're done with the process. So that was a very quick summary of a very complicated process. We are trying to get away from having a spreadsheet-mediated process so that we can validate people's comments, because people submit comments that are not valid. And what that means is we don't even know what you were commenting on. Right? We don't know what you mean. We can't find what you're talking about because you didn't enter all the information. Anything that you say that we can understand is valid whether we agree with it or not. But if we can't interpret what you submitted, then it's not valid. So we're moving to a Jira-based process where we can validate your comment and make sure we can understand what you intended to say. Yeah. In my dreams, you'll be able to right-click on the page and say, I want to comment on this bit. It seems as though that's just a bit too fantastical, and you'll just have to go to Jira. But there is at least a theoretical possibility that, and I'll talk about this in a second, but when we're looking at an implementation guide, that we will actually, the one that's under ballot, we will actually have, when we have these, we don't have. This implementation guide is how did that happen? It doesn't have the little self-link. It's a fail. In a typical implementation guide, a good implementation guide, I thought in all of them we have this little thing here that pops up, which I'm about to talk about anyway. Maybe next to it we can have a comment on this section, which will take you to JIRA and pre-fill out what we need to fill out to refer to that section. GForge, which you currently use, and we're desperate to get away from, doesn't let us do that, or we would have already done that. Any other comments or questions? Paul?
Yeah, just one behavior I've heard about, so I just wanted to sort of clarify. Some people, I think, vote affirmative on ballots because they're really endorsing the project. And that's really not the purpose of an affirmative.
We've got to get them from somewhere, Paul.
Pardon me?
We've got to get them from somewhere.
You've got to get, okay. I mean, everyone who's voting, especially negative voters, are people who care about the decision. An affirmative vote really means I've read through the material to the extent that I can, and I don't find any pieces, I didn't find any problems. That's really what the affirmative means.
I'm pretty sure I can say you've never given me an affirmative, so I've never had to ask that question about you. But you're right, yes, you are right.
When you moved to JIRA and you click on affirmative, it will actually have a statement that I have read this content.
Don't we already do that? I thought we already did that. Okay. All right, anything else about ballot? Okay, now, anybody can create a task in GForge anytime on any spec. And everybody does, or lots of people do, not everybody. Fortunately, not everybody. We get on average a task an hour coming in. And so you can comment anytime. You do not need to have it open for ballot. You can comment on the CI build, although typically doing that means that you're in the committee process, you're in the editorial process, because you know where we are. Because the CI build rolls over, it's sometimes completely inconsistent because someone's halfway through doing something. So choosing to come in on the CI build means that you understand what's going on and you're making a comment to further what's going on. So if you do, that's great. But the committee won't be happy with receiving a comment on something that's inconsistent because they were halfway through making a change. So commenting on the CI build belongs to people who are part of the process. You don't have to be part of the committee, you have to be part of the process. Okay, so then we publish milestone versions which stay stable, solid, frozen on the website, and we open those for ballot. So only members of HL7 or paid balloters can vote. You can buy your way into a ballot, or you can be a member. We are working on extending the ballot desktop to affiliates so that affiliates can ballot their implementation guides through the ballot desktop. It's as yet an incomplete process. Then all the ballot comments get converted to tasks in GForge, just like every other comment in GForge, although committees elect which tasks to consider and prioritise ballot tasks over non-ballot tasks. For normative ballots, which we haven't yet seen for an implementation guide, committees must consider all ballot comments, or everything else, committees can just not bother considering ballot comments, although that generally hasn't happened. They've looked at everything. They're not required to. The committees at the moment are generally looking at everything, whether it was a ballot comment or not.
What is required from an HL7 formal process and is required from a community expectation?
Right. So that's why, in practice, committees are actually reviewing anything. So in a sense, it's not particularly pertinent to comment on the ballot, but to vote on the ballot is something that's very meaningful because that is our decision-making criteria. And you can't vote negative in the ballot unless you actually submit a negative comment. We'll ignore your negative if you don't explain why you voted negative. So there's a bunch of reasons to be a member so you can ballot. And also, pretty much we ask editors and committers to be members as well, although you don't have to be. Any questions about all that? Good. Okay, now in the ballot spreadsheet, here we are, let's make this bigger so you can see what the heck I'm talking about here. That worked. All right. You can nominate for each line item, you could nominate a section, a resource name, an HTML page name, and a URL. What do you do with that? The section number is this here, 1.1. So 1.1. I better enable editing on this. Okay, 1.1. Because it serves my purpose to explain this issue. Or you can right-click on this, this one here, and copy this link. Copy link, and then paste that here. So when we're doing a ballot, that's both of those things are synonymous. If you are commenting on the CI build, the continuous integration build, don't use the section numbers, because the section numbers are auto-generated by the publisher, and if you reorganize the page, the section numbers change. Heaps of times I've been looking at a task, they're going section 6.2. I don't know what that was. I have no idea. But if you use the page name with the link name, which is what I paid here, the editors maintain these link names manually and they move with the content. So they know exactly what they're referring to. If it's a frozen version you're commenting on, it doesn't matter because we can go back and say, well, what section number was this in the version you are commenting on? But if you're commenting on the CI build, then you don't use the section number because we don't know what that was on the day that you commented. Okay, everyone's happy with that? All right. And when you make comment, one of the things you do in your comment is you indicate the issue type. You can make a negative ballot. You believe that the content of the material is not functional or incomplete or requires correction, and you must provide comments and they have to be resolved by the work group. You can expect to have some discussion with the work group about, or the editor, about your comments. Typically the editors go through all of the submitted comments and look at them and say, I don't think I agree, and then engage in discussion with you, and you might go, oh, no, actually I changed my mind, or you might go, I'm going to clarify so they understand. So you can expect a bit of to and fro on that. You can also make a number of different kind of affirmative votes. You can make, and really there's some lack of symmetry here. You can vote an affirmative vote without qualification, just say, love this stuff, it's good. I agree with this particular piece of information. This is a variation of Paul. They're actually indicating you actually read it. I like this section. Or you can make a suggestion and say, it'd be really good if you took this up, or here's a typo. Or you can ask a question, I don't understand this comment, or what would happen if I did this, or what's supposed to happen in this case? And I can just make a comment which is not a suggestion or a question. In practice, we really don't think of these very differently, except that we pull out the typos and try and treat them as typos. And then in terms of subcategory, we have correction and clarification and enhancement, although most people not inside the process have trouble differentiating between these. Correction means that the existing content has a problem. Clarification means that it's just not clear. They're pretty ambiguous between those two at times. And then I want to add something additional. Again, there's some ambiguity there. But we do actually ask for that. Okay, so now moving properly to reviewing an IG, having looked at the process. Here, the hardest part of reviewing an IG is getting going. And so there's a series of orientation questions you should ask. So I gave you the handout, and this is a checklist to follow if you're reviewing an IG following the overall description that I'm giving today. It's not a formal review, pro forma or spreadsheet, and it requires lots of check this because you did heaps of stuff, but it's just there as an example to get you going in terms of your idea for how you might go about reviewing an IG. So I'm basically going to work through it. Is there any left over? I forgot to get myself a copy. That would be pretty clever, wouldn't it? There was one left over? You want to go and grab yours from the back? Thank you. Yeah, it's really well prepared there. Okay, so first of all, orientation conceptual. This is just getting synced with the concept of the implementation guide. What realm is the implementation guide defined for? I'm going to assume that most of the implementation guides, most of this audience see will be US implementation guides, but not all. Some will be UV. And the nature of the community is very different for the different realms. Then what does it do? What kind? Is it, in terms of what we looked at, is it a domain or a community, or is it a realm IG? And this is now more narrative-based. What community does it represent? What do you know about the community that this implementation guide arises out of? It is possible that we'd have implementation guide arising out of a community of two editors who decided to do something and convinced everybody that they could. But mostly we look for a bigger community. Who are members of the community? What is driving them? It's really appropriate, if you're going to review an IG, that you understand that context of what the community is trying to do. Particularly when it comes to talking about what the implementation guide doesn't do. Why doesn't it do it? It's driven by the community that drives the implementation guide. And then what dependencies does it have and why? And does it not have dependencies you think it should have? So, for instance, US core doesn't have any dependencies. It's the standalone implementation guide, depends on the spec. Whereas if we go to DaVinci Path, it actually has a specific section that identifies the dependencies on which the implementation guide depends. That's not particularly a common pattern. Lloyd, that's something we should have somewhere, a list of the dependencies so that people can actually see them when they're reviewing the implementation guide. It's clear as crystal in the tooling view of the implementation guide, but it's not very clear at the moment. So that is something you should look for. Does this implementation guide depend on which other US implementation guides, if it's the US implementation guide? Sorry?
Generated as part of the template then?
That was for my note to Lloyd.
We need to put more into the implementation guide resource because there's a lot of narrative around them that explains the nature of the dependency. Saying this depends on US core, doesn't help much to understand how and why.
Yep. But as a reviewer, it's perfectly reasonable to expect that that subject to be addressed somewhere. And if you are following my piece of paper, you would get to check stated dependencies if stated. You would say, I can't find them. Then you would say to yourself, should there be? And if you think, yeah, I think there should be, then you would comment saying, I can't see the dependencies. I don't think I should. On the other hand, the US core or a US base or a Switzerland base or whatever, it would be inappropriate for it to have dependencies because National Implementation Guide. So check the dependencies and see what they are. Yes, always.
US core. US core does have parts of it that is based on the base spec. Does that mean the base spec is a dependency?
The base spec is a technical dependency, but every implementation guide depends on the base spec. So we take that one for granted. And instead we ask which of the base specs, and we require as a publishing feature that it be clearly identified in the implementation guide. And it's also up here as well. So it's in both places. And other than that, we assume that it depends on the core spec.
And
Yeah.
we use the dependencies on the IG level. I'm thinking if sometimes if we have a specific constraint, it's very hard to see, well, this thing is from this region, which inherited from the government, which inherited from the continent, which inherited from the base, whatever it is.
That's
It's
a
hard to
subject
track
we
that.
can take up later.
Okay.
Well, but in principle, let's have a look. So we'll go and look at, for instance, institutional encounter in Da Vinci. Yeah, that was an extension. That wasn't what I wanted. I wanted an actual profile. Here we go, a profile. So what a PAS claim will do. Oh no, that won't be what I want. So pre-authorization condition, hopefully. Okay, well here's for instance a ballotable issue if you decide it's ballotable. The Da Vinci PAS pre-authorization condition does not constrain US core condition. Should it? That would be a ballotable thing. I'll come back to that. All right. But so that one just depends straight off the base. But that would be, the differential tells you what's where. And you just trace the differentials back to know where, what is where, or what it comes from. It did say it depended on US core, but this structure is defined from the core condition, not the US condition. So so that's the core condition. So you would get to say, why shouldn't you come off US core? For instance, I don't believe that no subject is mandatory in the core. Okay, anyway. All right. So this is conceptual. Where does this IG fit into the overall ecosystem? And then finally, what does it do? And that is a big open question because they do such different things. They define totally different kinds of business processes. And this is the hardest part. What does the IG do? So I suggest that you spend an hour reading the introductory material and the description of the exchanges and then write a paragraph or two for yourself. What does this actually do as orientating yourself to the IG? Okay. Then the next thing to do is technical orientation. So the first thing you should do is there a note to balloters? So this is the home page. No, I'm in the wrong place near here now. This note to balloters, for instance. So you should always read that. You should go and see the directory of public versions and check on the change notes. In this case, this is the first public ballot, so there's no change notes. But if it's the second or third, or we're deep into the cycle, read the description. Why are we balloting this? What led to the ballot? What drove the change? It's part of your orientation. And then the other thing that you should do, every implementation guide we ever publish, whether it links to it or not, it includes a page called qa.html. And this page lists the implementation guide publisher's assessment of the quality of the implementation guide. And it lists you all of the errors that it found. Now, our goal for publishing an implementation guide is that this error list is empty. And about half the implementation guides we publish, the error list is entirely empty. But it's not always entirely empty, and scanning this will give you a sense of any issues that you should know exist. Now, some of these are like these ones. Some of them are mystifying and you won't have a clue what they are and just ignore them because they're for me. But this one is using ICD-9CM and the infrastructure doesn't know about ICD-9CM. So as a reviewer, you go, I don't think that makes any difference to me. Unless you're a terminology reviewer, in which case you go, well, it's an unknown code system, I'm going to make sure they're using it correctly because they don't have a technical infrastructure to help with that. Mind you, having the technical infrastructure doesn't prove that you used it correctly. Yes. So every implementation guide has a QA.html, which you can look at.
Should we?
It's part of what we publish.
Graham?
Sorry. Yes.
Should we look at the ignored warnings as well to see if people are sweeping things under the carpet?
Yeah, although typically I sweep that out when we publish because it's useful as an editorial process to say, hey, these 4 errors, I know about them, so I'll put them in the suppressed error messages so that I get this down to 0 and I can see at a glance that it's a 0, it's all green, it's all good. But then when we go into ballot, I'm like, that's no benefit anymore. I'll just delete all the suppressed messages and make sure they all come back up here. Yeah.
So does the HL7 publication check all okay? Sorry. Where it says HL7 publication check all okay mean that all these errors were deemed by you or Lynn to not be a problem, or does that mean something else?
No, that's something else. That means that all of the versioning and the package list declarations are all have integrity. Lynn and I will check that and say we can't even publish if that's not all correct. It's a publication rules check for us. It doesn't mean that we proved everything else for publication, just that the package list and versions and PARs and everything were all correct.
Thanks.
Okay, so as a reviewer, you don't need to do anything about the errors, but they may guide you in terms of what you prioritize for reviewing. If you see a very long list of errors with lots of broken profiles not valid and stuff, then you might go, I don't think this is worth much of my time. Or you might go, this is a problem. I want to give it lots of time. I can't tell you how the QA will guide you, other than I recommend that you have a quick look at it to get a sense of where we are. And if you see an implementation guide with no errors, either it has no content or the editor was very thorough. Okay. Now, the next question is, what's the approach of the IG? What exchanges are described, if any? Does it have APIs? Does it have documents? Does it describe a document exchange? Does it describe messaging? If it describes messaging, what kind of messaging? Most of our IGs are API-based, but not all of them by a long shot. And then, given the kinds of exchanges they describe, where did the content go? Problem lists, medication list, coverages, encounters, episodes, patient demographics, where did they all go in the implementation guide? Is the place where they've gone consistent with the expectations created by the Realm core? This is the hardest part of the review because the way people solve problems is appropriately very variable. And so stuff disappears into all sorts of different places. And sometimes, so for instance, there's one IG which we'll come back to where one version of the IG said that laboratory reports are published in observations, whereas other implementation guys say laboratory reports are published in diagnostic reports. So you could go ahead and review the profiles and completely miss the fact that the stuff was just in a different place. Now, I thought that was wrong. The laboratory reports should be in diagnostic reports. But the point that I'm making is you don't dive in to consider the profiles and compare the profiles. You first of all got to understand what's going on so you know what to compare with what, and you've kept track of where things have gone so that you don't end up comparing apples with apples or oranges or just missing stuff altogether. And I can't give you any better advice other than that you have to understand what the IG is doing because they are so different and appropriately different and inappropriately different as well. Yeah.
So knowing there's no template, I have a feeling I know the answer to this, but I just want to hear the first part, what exchanges are described. Is there any particular place that should be? Because I reviewed an IG that I had a hard time answering those questions.
Yeah, and it is, so the answer is right now for everything we currently published, no. We are standardizing, but I'm not convinced, given the variety of things that are valid to say, that we will get down to this is how the implementation guide will be laid out. Mm-hmm. But also, if you review an IG and after half an hour you still haven't figured out what exchanges it's describing, that IG's got a problem.
Yeah, which
so
I indicated in the comments.
Ballot just on that alone, right? Yeah. And we do occasionally get ballot comments saying, I started reviewing this and I just stopped. Fix this and ballot it again so we know what we're doing. And so that happens. So that when you make a response like that, that's really difficult for the committee, because the committee might be like, you jumped down a rabbit hole because you misread one paragraph, or we made one paragraph unclear and you didn't go this way and you went that way and you got to the end of the road that way, and then you stopped because you couldn't figure out where you were. Everything else was really good, and if you hadn't jumped down that rabbit hole, it would have been really good, and now you're telling us we have to do a whole cycle, right? So you should avoid saying, I couldn't figure out which way is up. Figure that out and then I'll have another look, right? That's like a last resort kind of thing. But you can, if you really can't figure it out, you've got to say that to the committee. I don't figure it out what the heck you were doing with your implementation guide. And so, yes, I split this in my slide. I split the next bit up. Okay, so this is the hardest bit. And I review a lot of implementation guides and I scan them and I have a feel for where some of this stuff is, but I don't have time to engage with them deeply. But that is the hardest part.
Brian,
yes, sure.
Realm specific or implementation guides, is this a good idea or not?
It's kind of like asking me whether gravity is a good idea. I mean, every realm has its own rules and its own culture and its own requirements, and we cannot avoid having an Australian base, and I think a New Zealand base, and a US base, and a Swiss, and a UK, and a Canada. I've seen all those ones, because you need to say this is where the base stuff goes. But then you've got behaviour that's cross-border. So, for instance, I've just drafted an international patient access, which is different to international patient summary, and we'll have a quick look at it later as a tool for exploring an issue. And that one is realm agnostic, but then each realm has to say, well, what does it look like in practice in our realm? Because there's things you can't say because you're not in a realm.
Yeah, I'm not sure how useful it is in New Zealand, having worked on various national interoperability projects with vastly different requirements, even down to the patient level. So I'm not sure how it will play out in a large federal country. I mean, we're a small unitary country, but even within, say, GP to GP and our National E-Prescription Service, there are vastly different rules on patient, for example.
Well, remember the Wishel rule: change the consensus group, change the consensus.
Well, that's, yeah.
So a national base implementation guide should be regulation driven, so that you've got something really solid. It's not just what you arbitrarily decided. But then, for instance, in Australia we have the MyHR, and it's a whole specification stack for the national health record, and then at some stage sense will prevail and we'll redesign it, and then we'll have an entirely different stack of documents. And so national specifications are prone to being taken over by a particular interest.
Well, that's your brittle base class syndrome, isn't it?
It is, that's right. So But in the end, because regulations exist and we have to conform, you'll end up having national specifications to deal with that. And it's like saying, is gravity a good thing? I don't know, but it is. Anything else? Oh yeah, so I'll do this slide and then we'll stop and have a break. So on the orientation approach, you should make a list of the actors described in the system. Some of our implementation guides are fairly formal about this and describe actors explicitly, and IHE implementation guides always describe actors explicitly, and some of them are less explicit. Some of them don't really help you at all. But when you characterize the actors, you should characterize them as producer or consumer or repository. It's not the same as server and client, because we can mix push and pull and subscribe, and IGs might do bits of that, or they might do something else. But a producer originates the information and has to make sure that it meets your requirements. A consumer does something with the information, and a repository stores it and makes it available. And sometimes the repository and the producer might be the same, and sometimes they might not. And so, try and sort of categorize the actors by that, because they give you a sense of what obligations accrue to the different actors.